Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Global Compensation and Benefits Watch, a webcast series from the Conference Board focusing on topics facing international companies relating to executive and workforce compensation, health and retirement benefits, and mobility. I'm Paul Washington, Executive Director of the ESG Center here at the Conference Board. The ESG Center focuses on helping companies define and fill their evolving role in society by delivering trusted insights in corporate governance, sustainability, and citizenship. Today's webcast is going to address a couple of fascinating topics. We're going to be discussing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on executive compensation, both on in-flight and future compensation programs for executives, as well as compensation and benefits programs generally for employees. And second, we'll be talking about incorporating ESG metrics into incentive compensation plans, whether annual or long-term, for your executives. This webcast is being sponsored by the law firm of Cleary Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton, and I'm really delighted to be joined by an all-star cast of 4 experts to help us explore the topics today. I'd like to welcome Michael Urbano from Cleary Gottlieb. He's partner there. Michael, glad to have you. David Calder is Senior Counsel, Executive Compensation and HR Transactions at the 3M Company. Welcome, David. Great. And Audrey Casasol is a partner at the law firm of Sidley & Austin, my alumni firm. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Blair, great. And Blair Jones, who really just goes by Blair, because everyone knows if you say it's Blair Jones. Is Managing Director at Similar Broadway Consulting Group. Welcome, Blair.
Thanks so much.
All right. So before we begin, I have the ever fascinating topic of housekeeping matters to cover. All right. First, you can download the background materials and slide deck for today's presentations in the download section at the bottom of your screen. Please note that you can only access these materials if you're watching this program on a computer. If you aren't doing that and you'd like to receive any materials, please fill out your name in the chat box and we'll send them to you after the webcast. Second, we are offering New York State CLE credit for participating in today's live program. For CLE credit, please download the CLE verification and the CLE evaluation forms posted in the download section at the bottom of your screen, complete them, and email them to our friends at Cleary Gottlieb at the email address provided on the forms. For attorneys seeking credit outside of New York, please list your relevant bar information on the verification form and we'll work on getting you credit in another state. I'll be providing some CLE verification codes throughout this broadcast. For those of you who want CPE credit, you need to click the link in the CEU request pod in the bottom right corner of the webcast console to sign up for such credit. Please note that 3 pop-up messages will occur during the program to confirm your participation. Please click OK each time you see one of those if you're looking for CPE credit. I also want to underscore that we really do welcome audience participation today. So please, if you've got a question, type it into the chat box and we'll definitely try to work it into our conversation. And if we don't get to it, we'll answer it afterwards. Finally, a couple final housekeeping notes. Please complete, there's an evaluation form. This is different from the CLE evaluation form. Please complete this at the end of the webcast. It helps us do a better job in future webcasts. You can also share this program with your colleagues after the fact. It's going to be available on demand in a couple days. If you want to see more of us, you can enlarge your screen to full screen view by clicking on the 4 arrows in the upper right-hand side of your screen. And finally, I think we all know this because we're all baby Zoomers these days. You know, if you want your best experience watching this webcast, close out your other apps. Okay, so now with all of that really fascinating stuff out of the way, we're going to talk about compensation and benefits in the era of COVID and ESG. So let's first start with some questions about the impact of the pandemic. Just to set the stage here, the pandemic has had a widespread impact, obviously, on the performance of companies, But relatively few companies thus far have announced changes to executive compensation. About 20% of the Russell 3000 has announced that they're reducing base salaries, but only about 7% of the Russell 3000 has announced changes to their incentive compensation plans. And one of the questions that companies are facing in this environment is, do you provide the board with more discretion when it comes to awarding 2020 bonuses? So let's start with a poll question on that. Just take the pulse of the audience on this one. So if we can put that up, the poll question for everyone to answer is your board planning to exercise more discretion than in the past with respect to 2020 annual bonuses? Okay. All right. I think we can end the poll in a little bit. There we go. So this is interesting. It's actually about what I expected, because we've been hearing that a lot of companies are sort of letting the chips fall where they may when it comes to 2020 bonuses. But Audrey, you're really the expert on this. What do you see happening with 2020 annual bonuses for executives? Are they going to let the chips fall where they may? Are they going to be exercising more discretion? What other sort of steps are companies planning to take with respect to 2020 bonuses?
Thanks, Paul. I think it's a great question. It's definitely something that's on a lot of my clients' minds. I think it's important to note that particularly for annual bonus cycles, a lot of companies and clients were setting these goals when we all had what is now sort of a humbling sense of our predictability of the future. And so, maybe people took into account that 2020 might be impacted by COVID, but a lot of companies didn't. I think with the realization now that COVID is lasting longer than people expected, that the impact is very unpredictable, that this is truly unprecedented, it's led to a reluctance among my clients to really sort of change things midstream and commit to an outcome now. So yes, I'm definitely seeing a lot more reliance on discretion, a lot more comfort in a wait-and-see approach with the knowledge that there's both in-plan internal discretion to adjust as necessary to put a little bit more focus on individual performance, if appropriate, but also external discretion, letting the chips fall where they may, and if that means doing sort of a one-time supplementary bonus to people to try to keep them motivated, because that's really the tension I'm seeing, keeping employees motivated through an extraordinary time versus managing investor relations and liquidity concerns. Where I am seeing changes, there's been focus on individual performance and more relative performance, and what I've been cautioning my clients about is really thinking ahead to the disclosure impact of any changes that they're potentially contemplating and also the accounting implications.
Got it. Right. So you're not seeing people sort of dramatically move the goalposts in 2020, but you are seeing people sort of thinking, well, we may want some more discretion, or maybe we're going to do something, that's a little supplemental or separate to recognize this, because, okay, maybe they completely missed their goals for the 2020 bonus, but we do want to do something to recognize the extraordinary effort. So that's interesting on that. I don't know if anyone else has any comments on 2020 bonuses.
I mean, I think, sorry, Claire, go ahead.
So, Paul, I would just say probably a few things to think about. One, if you are going to use discretion, so for these 26% of companies, having a scorecard of sorts that your committee can use to make decisions can be very, very helpful, and getting that in front of them, as soon as possible will help the discussion, and it will also help the disclosure later. So the kinds of things that are showing up on the dashboards are things like what has our relative performance been, what is our absolute performance been to any recast goals, how are we doing versus our most important peers, what are we doing on strategic goals that might position us to succeed better post-COVID, what is the experience our employees been. This is going to be a theme I'm sure we're talking about throughout this webinar. So all of those need to come into play. There was some early discussion that perhaps people would be rewarding just for leadership during crisis. while that might be an element of individual performance, I think these bigger dashboards that people are using will be different. So that would be one thing. The second thing is I am seeing some clients find that it's easier with everything going on if you're multi-divisional just to measure at the corporate level. So if you're going to do discretion, it's sort of we're one team now versus doing too much differentiating, because sometimes it's just you were in the wrong place at the wrong time relative to where COVID hit. So that is a consideration. The final thing you have to think about is how much you want to pay. And I think most organizations that have been severely hit are thinking about the 25 to 50% level, so somewhere up the threshold. There may be some other companies where their formula has come out at about 40%, and they feel like they've had an okay year. Their stock price has recovered, and they might be going up to the 75 to 80% range.
Great. That's really helpful. And what you just talked about, too, is that discretion doesn't just mean subjectivity, right? So it's structured discussion, and so that helps with the disclosure, too. Yeah, Michael?
I think my experience has been consistent with what has been said, both by Audrey and Blair. I just wanted to raise one interesting question I got, because it's not the most common, which is the idea of using negative discretion to lower a bonus payout, particularly in an industry that has done well during the pandemic. And I've had a client reach out to me in that regard to see what, if anything, we were seeing in the market there. And I have not yet seen anyone announce that or make that determination, but it's another thing to think about, particularly when you, as Blair mentioned, you think about the optics and what's going on in the broader, your broader workforce, and just generally whether you have some sort of concern about there being pay for luck, essentially, because of the pandemic driving the business, which may not have been what the executives control.
Right. No, that's a really interesting question. Often the adjustments go one way there. It seems like, and Blair and others, I'd be interested in what your thinking is on this, but it seems to me that as long as the executives aren't benefiting in a way that's out of proportion to the rank and file employees, it's okay to reward people. If you're at a medical testing company and you're doing well, but you've also been working extremely hard, and if your employees are being also compensated, higher than normal, it doesn't seem like it would cause big red flags for investors if you've got that story to sort of pay above target. But I don't know if you're hearing anything differently, Blair or Audrey or David, from your perspective.
No, I think that that's right. And I do think that as sort of keeping with the spirit of things, as long as companies are truly letting performance pay be at risk, including through the hard times, sometimes then there's a variety of approaches that are consistent with that. And I think it really falls to the company, to the narrative that they're telling about why they're making these changes and being very transparent.
So let's turn, Blair, to long-term incentives. So we have seen companies announce a sort of broader array of changes to their in-flight long-term incentive plans. And a lot of the annual bonuses, they said, okay, we're lowering your target or we're getting rid of it. But in-flight programs, because they cover the 3 years. You've got your last year of the 2018 to 20, you're in the middle of 2019 to 21, and then you were at the start of the 20 to 22 plans. But some are changing metrics, some are changing performance periods, some are also allowing for more discretion. But this is harder in some ways, maybe even than annual bonus, because this spans 3 years. So what's your advice to companies right now grappling with how to deal with this 1 year of these 3 multi-year in-flight long-term incentive plans?
Yeah, this is the hard question for this year, because in contrast, in contrast, well, thank you, I feel honored. Yeah, in contrast to the annual incentives where the investors have expressed a willingness to entertain discretion, there have been more roadblocks put up relative to the expectations for long-term incentives. Both of the proxy advisors have said don't touch them, and different investors have also come out with that general guidance. Now, that, so with that said, the majority practice is going to be people letting 18 to 20 play out, just according to formula, and for many companies that's going to be a 0 if they have heavy financial performance weighting. And then for the 19 to 21 and the 20 to 22 cycles, they're frankly, I think, waiting and seeing if there's better guidance going into those, modifying those cycles. I do have a number of clients who are thinking about increasing the 2021 grants, maybe in the 20 to 30% range, and maybe doing that on a differentiated basis for their NEOs as a way to recognize that we need to keep people motivated and we need to recognize that our past measures aren't working. Just a couple of cautions, because there are companies who are thinking about changing. So if you're thinking about changing, in many cases, there is going to be an accounting modification, which means then when you report your summary compensation table, you're not only going to be reporting the 2020 grant, but you're going to be reporting the value of the grants that you modified. That's just the way the accounting works. It sees that as adding value that wasn't there. So you have to account for it somewhere. So that's caution number one. Caution number two is there'll be less receptivity to changing your plans if you have relative TSR or any other relative metric in it, because I think the investors think those plans should just work. So for those who do have financial weighted LTIs where 3 cycles are impacted, if you're going forward, it's all about the story. It's about why are we doing this? Why do we think these metrics that we're resetting right now help investors? How is this not a full second chance? So you want to put some shareholder-friendly things in. Maybe you want to say, well, reduce the maximum payout. You can only get 100%, or you can only get 150%. You also might want to say we're not going to pay over 100% of these recast cycles if we don't fit at the 55th percentile above of peers in TSR kind of thing. So you want some guardrails to show shareholders you're aware that you've reset and that you're trying to take into account the full experience.
Got it, right, so that it remains at risk, and you're not just getting, we're not just protecting you against the downside. There's actually still, your compensation is still at risk here. This isn't, it's not guaranteed long-term incentive.
Correct.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So let's talk about the future of long-term incentive compensation plans. Having gone through this year, and people are thinking about what they do for their 21 to 23 LTI plans. I mean, David, you've done some interesting things at 3M that have sort of maybe helped prepare you for the future. But what suggestions would you have for companies who are grappling with designing their LTI programs for the future that might help them during times of great unpredictability? Oh, David, you may be on mute.
Sorry about that. So one of the things that I think 3M has grappled with in the past is the same situation that a lot of companies are facing today. We had a circumstance following the 2008 Great Recession where 3 different cycles of performance share awards were paying out at very low levels, and the decision was made to sort of rethink the design of our awards. Following that consideration, we decided to move toward a program where we have fixed goals set up front for a 3-year performance period, but we measure performance against those goals on an annual basis, so that when you have a circumstance like 2020, and if you're in one of those industries, think aviation or hospitality or any number of other industries that have seen a significant downturn this year through no fault of the management or the employees, you don't see the entire value or incentive value of those awards just sort of flushed away. So now you have, yes, you've lost 2020 maybe, but you still have the 2018, 2019 years to carry the 2018 to 2020 cycle, or you've got 21 and 22 to carry the 20 to 22 cycle. So that's worked very well for us. We see that as benefiting both, as being fair to both stockholders and employees, executives in particular, because if it prohibits or protects the stockholders from any potential windfall that might be given to the executives as a result of a pandemic-induced, drive up in the business. Think Zoom or Amazon, those types of companies that have really benefited from the current circumstances, not particularly because anything the executives did well, but because just the nature of the pandemic led to an increase in their business. But it also protects executives from the downside, and that also played out in 2020 here.
That's interesting. So you basically banked it along the way. Now, did you get any feedback from investors who sort of say, okay, well, it's nice that you've got the goal set for 3 years, but it almost sounds like this is another version of an annual bonus plan, right? But it's, because you are banking it each year. So, what have the conversations been like with investors on this?
We've had some conversations with investors that have expressed, that general concern. I would say that it has not been a significant issue for 3M. Mm-hmm. I think, we feel that pretty strongly that setting the goals up front and measuring your performance against them over the full 3-year cycle addresses that concern. It's not that we're moving the goalpost as we go along through the cycle. So it's just a matter of how you calculate the payout formula.
Yeah. That approach that you're talking about, we started to see before the pandemic a slight push for companies to think beyond 3 years. Mm-hmm. And your model might enable companies to start to think about 5-year goals, 4 or 5-year goals, because you're not putting everything at risk with, like 1 or 2 bad years out of those 5. You could allow people to think. So you actually could, using your model, think about extending the performance period beyond 3 years. It's a possibility.
You could, and I think, if I'm getting down sort of further in the details of 3M's model, if we were to move toward a 5-year performance period, one thing that we do that's another step different from a lot of other companies when we go with this program is we weight each of the years differently. So we don't have 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 weighting. The first year is weighted 50%, second year 30%, third year 20%, with the idea being that you should be able to more accurately forecast and predict what performance will be in the first year of the cycle versus the second versus the third. And so if we were to go out 5, I would imagine we'd still follow a graded schedule like that, and you wouldn't see just a 20% weighting for each year in the 5-year performance period.
Interesting. Yeah. Hey, Blair, you're talking to a lot of companies. What having gone through or we're still going through it, but as we're going through the pandemic, what kinds of advice would you give to companies as they're designing the future LTI programs? The 3M model seems like an interesting one. Any other thoughts?
Now, you might want to turn the question to someone else and get my dog a little better.
Okay. All right. We'll come back on that one because we have an unexpected panelist. But that's okay. So we'll come back. But because I've got a couple of questions on LTI and engagement. But why don't we go, Michael? Can we just pause on exec comp for a moment and do broader comp and benefits? It's probably a good segue there too. Anyway, so the pandemic's impact on compensation goes well beyond the C-suite. So what are some of the broader challenges that companies are thinking about making to their comp and benefits plans now, and what should they be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, obviously with all the stresses on the business that many companies have seen, that they have to look much broader than the C-suite. There's a overlay of an optics human capital management kind of issue here, right, which is just to tie it to the executive C-suite a little bit. Everything you do at the C-suite, I think you have to take into account the broader context and the other stakeholders you have, particularly your workforce and your employees. And so there's a few things. I mean, I think there's been a wide array of actions taken with respect to the broader workforce, but there's a few I want to highlight because they do tie back into some of the things that people that I get questions about on the exec comp side. So, for instance, you have a lot of reductions in pay, obviously, right? That hasn't just been at the C-suite. They've tended to be much, as a percentage, much smaller than you'll see at the C-suite. And then you have layoffs and furloughs. What I think is interesting about the timing of all that is we have the CEO pay ratio to deal with. And for many companies that just had one, the initial go in 2017, right, it's time now to reset that median employee. And so a lot of the questions we get are, how do we consider some of these impacts, right? We've had a significant reduction in force, we've reduced pay, and those all are going to factor into your median employee. And even for those folks who may have set a newer one since the initial go, right, if you have a significant change in your business, that's another possibility that you'd have to recalculate. So a lot of companies are looking at that. The SEC had a C&DI on this on furloughs because, you know, everyone has their own definition of what a furlough is. And the question that I think people are wondering is, if I have a furloughed workforce, do they count in the calculation? Are they out of the calculation? And the SEC, not surprisingly, punted to a facts and circumstances type analysis to understand that, and whether there's an expectation that they'd return to work. Is it a furlough of hours versus, you know, they're just been kind of temporarily laid off? So that's one thing that folks are thinking about. On the more positive side, we've seen hero bonuses, frontline workers getting increased pay, increased wage rates. One of the interesting questions that I've seen on that is adding back those expenses for purposes of C-suite annual bonuses. When you're figuring out your funding of your annual bonus plan, do you add those back in as an extraordinary circumstance? Which is just an interesting question for folks to consider. And then we've seen a lot, obviously, on the virtual and telehealth space in the benefits realm, a lot of remote work, home office setup, home technology, transportation benefits for frontline workers, particularly in organizations where people have to go in, but they're in cities that rely on public transportation, right? In New York City, one of the reasons why we've never really gotten back to any sort of sense of normalcy is people are worried about how to deal with the subway system. That brings in question perks. And if you thought perks couldn't get any more confusing and muddier, you know, the SEC came out again with another C&DI on that point. And things like home technology, where you set up a home office, traditionally might have been thought for the C-suite as a perk. Today may not be, right, given stay-at-home orders, et cetera. So, you know, I think we've seen a lot of that in terms of the changes that have been made. On the benefit side, you see a lot of paid leave policies being reviewed. You know, forcing people to use vacation days has been a common thing in certain industries. Not carrying over days to try and manage expenses. There's a lot of talk going into 2021 that I've seen on sharing of the health savings. Obviously, I think a lot of people expect that the lull in health costs for employers are going to go up again in 2021. But I've seen people freezing premium rates and those sorts of things to kind of pass those savings along. And then, you know, again, enhanced telemedicine, mental health, obviously, is a huge topic. A lot of focus on that. I think outside of the pandemic, it was growing in relevance. Maybe as a lawyer in our field, it's been a huge thing of what people are focused on, but I think more broadly. And then retirement plans, you know, the CARES Act has provisions that people have been focused on in terms of hardship distribution, increased plan loan limits, et cetera. So there's a lot out there for people to choose from, and I think it depends on your particular facts and circumstances as to what makes a lot of sense.
Great. Well, more than traditional SEC facts and circumstances guidance, you gave us a lot of good ideas. No, that's a really helpful menu for companies to be thinking about. So let's go back to exec comp, because the dog wants to weigh in on this, Blair. No. But maybe so let's shift back to you know, we talked about 3M's example of how they're dealing with that, and Dave, we've got a specific question from the audience. I want to ask you about that in a moment. But Blair, what's your advice to companies having gone through what we're going through about their future LTI programs?
So I think there are a few things to think about. Nearer term, for those companies who are still unstable, there has been a move to de-risk the LTI a little bit, meaning that we were on a path moving the LTI mix to something like 60-40 performance shares versus other vehicles, or 70-30. You know, for a short period of time, some companies are going to be coming back to more of a 50-50 type of balance. There are companies that have pushed that boundary further, but the investment community so far has seemed to suggest that they're not quite ready for all companies to go way the other way. So the safest path is a 50-50 type of path. But more importantly, because that's really a short-term, you know, volatility-oriented type of solution, is to think about multiple measures. I think that this has highlighted why having not only a portfolio approach to long-term incentives, but also a portfolio approach to measures is very important. It's usually a good idea to avoid unintended consequences anyway. But if you've been reliant, for instance, as EPS as your only measure, or ROIC as your only measure, you're pretty vulnerable. So thinking about multiple measures could make sense. I know we're going to talk about ESG later, and I do think there will be an opportunity in the future to introduce ESG metrics into long-term incentive plans. And if not ESG metrics, other kinds of strategic metrics that might be longer-term oriented. I know that I have a client in the food service industry right now that really, you know, with restaurants opening and closing and it differing by geography, had a hard time figuring out where to set goals. And they focused exclusively for their they're a non-fiscal year-end company. They focused exclusively on strategic goals, but strategic goals that are meaningful about getting the business back on track. So again, maybe not long-term to go 100% strategic, but to have some component of strategic or ESG probably will make sense. I also think companies are going to be rethinking the pay and performance relationship. It's been practiced to be, you know, pretty tight thresholds and high rewards if you're overperforming. At least in the near term, given the shock of what's happened with COVID, I think companies will widen their performance curves and maybe have a little bit softer landing but less steep upside, so a little bit harder to earn 200%, but maybe that's a reasonable trade-off. And, you know, I'm expecting, you know, for the next 3-4 years, I think those kinds of things will happen. Now, the 3M approach makes sense for companies, as Dave said, who might be in aerospace, they might be in hospitality, you know, where they really can't set goals. And if they don't have a TSR type of goal to fall back on, that can be a good solution because it does still require growth, but allows some line of sight near term.
Yeah, and that's really interesting too, what you said about the maybe not making it so easy to get 200%. So it's softening the impact on the downside, but lowering it, because we've heard from a lot of investors who are kind of darn frustrated with PSU programs, right? I mean, they all said we wanted performance shares, but it's not quite working out the way we thought, right? And it's not that companies are setting wrong goals or not challenging goals. It's just that there are a lot more payouts at a higher levels than I think investors expected. So this may be an opportunity to reset that, and the way you were talking about it, I think, could address that. You know, not being as harsh when you miss, but not being as generous with maybe fairly somewhat modest outperformance.
Yeah,
on the upside.
Absolutely. And I should have said on the downside, if people are softening the downside, they're also paying less. They're not paying 50% for 70% of target performance. They're paying 25% or 10% for that kind of performance.
Got it. Yeah. So, David, let me just address one sort of technical question that came in from Glenn. He says, does setting 3 annual goals for a 3-year performance cycle instead of 3-year goals, and I'm not sure that's what you're doing, but does that impact how and when the grant is reflected in the summary compensation table?
So what we're doing is setting a 3-year goal that's just we measure performance against that goal every year. So I think maybe a bit of semantics there versus setting 3 1-year goals. But to the extent you are setting up your award so that it has a goal for year one, and that's approved by the comp committee at the time the grant is made, but you're not setting goals for years 2 and 3, then I don't think you have a grant date from an accounting perspective. It's been a while since I've looked at this, and that I could see impacting when it would show up in the summary comp table. And I don't know if Michael or Audrey or anyone else wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. You would, if you set, and I have clients who used to do that, but then got swayed by investors away from that, but where you basically set the first year goal in year 1, then you wait till year 2 to set the next goal, and so you wouldn't have the grant date. And so that second year grant would have to be reported in the next year's summary comp table, and it kind of goes that way. There's also some interesting disclosure in the grant of plan-based awards table and whatnot, but it can lead to some confusing disclosure with footnotes and trying to explain what's going on.
Got it. So what you're doing is setting the goals for 3 years.
Right.
So before we transition to ESG, Blair, I just don't know if you or others have comments about during this whole time what makes for effective engagement during this time. Clearly, there's going to be a higher level of engagement, but are there any particular third rails for investors? You mentioned the proxy advisory firms when it comes to changes to LTI programs, and some investors, they haven't gone quite as far as the proxy advisory firms on that. But any particular things to really avoid, and any hints as to sort of how to make engagement really constructive? Where you can kick off, and then others please weigh in.
Sure, I'll be glad to. So I think what investors are worried about is forgiveness. They thought they had to pay for performance equation, and if it's, heads I win, tails you lose, that's a non-starter for them, and I think they go into this season with a fair amount of concern about that. The second thing that they're worried about is this reliance on the retention argument. I think they've been pretty clear that they've got some skepticism as to whether there's retention, and I don't mean to discount for any company out there how severe the retention considerations can be, because I know for a number of my clients who have been highly affected by this, it's a big deal. But the bar is higher for retention-oriented types of things. And then the other thing they're looking at is how in sync are you with the other stakeholders' experience, and particularly the employee experience. So for all of my clients doing engagement this fall, they've been talking a lot about what's happening with employees. Whether the furloughed employees have been brought back to work, whether 401k matches have been restored, all of the things that Michael was talking about. Have you done the increase in minimum wage? Have you done the special bonuses? Because they don't want to see you being out of sync with that employee experience in particular, but also suppliers and customer experiences. So this is a reputational issue for the company, and investors are going to be digging into that. Now, so what that means is, I think in going into these sessions, you want to think about what was your performance before the pandemic hit, and what is it now. And for many companies, they were doing great, and but if you were doing poorly before and then the COVID just made it worse, you need to go in thinking about that context. But you want to frame the performance and frame where you are on your journey to the investor community. Second, you want to think about what has been the experience of the employees and make sure that you're able to convey that we're working this holistically. And that's a new discussion, but a really important discussion. And it's going to be important, maybe less so for at least in ISS, because ISS has said they really aren't focusing on that issue, but there are a number of investors who care very deeply about that particular issue. And then to talk about, if you are using discretion or if you are making changes, how that helps you be in a better position to take advantage of 2021 and the post-COVID era. So for my client who couldn't set any financial goals, they talked about the new channels they were going into. They talked about how they're taking market share. They talked about things that are concrete that actually are valuable to shareholders, and what you're not, in many cases you haven't made these decisions, so you're kind of testing the waters and saying, here's what we're thinking about, but investors want to hear how it's going to help increase their value over time.
That's all really helpful. And what you're saying about the focus on how executives are doing, not just as compared to how the investors are doing, but how employees and customers and others are doing, is really important. We heard that actually initially in the spring, and then we put out a report, as you know, on what investors representing 12 trillion in assets are looking for, and a message that came through loudly and clearly on top of concerns about diversity at the board and management levels, was really about executive compensation. And we're not just going to look at it through the lens of alignment with shareholders. It's got to be alignment of executive compensation with what's happening with the rest of your workforce. So going through Michael's very good list and saying what you're doing and having a holistic story, I think is really key, as well as whatever you're doing now, how does it affect future performance? So that's great. Before we turn to ESG, any other comments on investor engagement? All right, so let's turn to the question of ESG, but I have one housekeeping thing, which is your CLA verification code. You've all been waiting for this. It is 12349, 12349. Okay, so now we're going to turn to ESG metrics in executive compensation. And let me turn to a poll question, and then we'll put a little context behind this. So if we can pull up a poll question. Is your company planning to put ESG metrics more prominently in your incentive compensation plans? Okay. So this is interesting. So it's not entirely different from what we had before, but there is a higher level of uncertainty, right, about what people are going to be doing with ESG metrics. To put this in a little bit broader perspective, we're coming out with a report from the Conference Board looking at 2020 disclosures in the S&P 1200, and we found that about a quarter of the companies in the global S&P 1200 are incorporating ESG metrics into their executive compensation plans. Now, a lot of those are diversity, equity, inclusion, safety, greenhouse gas emissions. Those are the most common ones. But it does vary a lot by industry. For example, the energy industry, almost 80% of the companies have incorporated some form of ESG metric into their incentive compensation plans. So let's talk about two places you can do it, annual and long term. So David, could you talk us a little bit about the advice you would have for companies that are thinking about incorporating ESG metrics into their annual incentive plans?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the one, just to go back for 1 second, the poll, the one issue I might take with the poll is that it asked if companies were intending to incorporate ESG metrics more prominently into their plans going forward, but it didn't sort of clarify when, right? Is it next year, the second or third, fifth year after that? So I do think that there is certainly going to be a push toward inclusion of ESG metrics. I think there will be a mix of companies and how quickly they move to incorporate those metrics. I think if you're going to start incorporating them into an annual incentive plan in 2021, I think you need to be very cautious about what metric you choose or how you incorporate it, right? Because you can quickly grab a diversity metric and put it into your plan and say, okay, if our diversity initiatives yield this result, then we're going to pay out at X rate, or we're going to modify the amount that would otherwise be payable. I think the concern with that is you get what you reward, and you have to be careful not to just incentivize, one specific action, right? If you just incentivize hiring diverse people, you might then cause unintended consequences of discrimination against what I'll say Caucasians, right, or whatever. You might have other issues that could come up from that. So I think companies need to be very careful when they think about what metric to include. You need to think about the possibility that inclusion of one metric may lead some people to say you place less importance on another metric. So if you put diversity in there, ESG, your greenhouse gas emissions may be seen as sort of a secondary of secondary importance, which may not be the right message you want to send and could actually hinder your progress in that area. So I think at 3M, we've given some thought to how we would go about incorporating ESG metrics. At this point, we have not found one metric that we think is measurable, is something that would be applicable to all functions and businesses within the organization, right? Because different parts of the company have different profiles, and we haven't found a metric that we think is going to drive sustainable long-term growth. Not a single metric anyway. So we're still on the hunt. We're still looking for a way to incorporate ESG as a metric in our plan. I think for now, what we're doing, and I don't know when this will change. I'm sure times change. 3M will change with them. What we do is we incorporate it into the performance rating system. So we have each executive will have one or more ESG goals, and their performance against those goals will factor into their performance ratings, which can affect their AIP payout both positively and negative, and could also, depending on the circumstances, affect their upward progression within the company, or their time with the company.
Great. That's really helpful. So you're still thinking through, but the big point is really think it through and don't just leap into it with a single metric, because that seems to be what people ought to be doing now. Yeah.
I think the events of 2020 have obviously shown a very hot spotlight on ESG matters, and I think companies need to respond. I think there's a lot of pressure to respond quickly and appear that you heard the message. But I think how you respond needs to be very thoughtful. This is not an area that you can wade into lightly and expect to have success with. Because if you put a metric out, let's say, and then you have to start reporting performance against that metric, and you may not like the results you have to publish, that can be problematic. If you put out a metric, like I said, and it encourages some unintended behavior, that could be a problem. So I just think you need to be very mindful of the pitfalls.
Yeah, and there are different ways, as you said, of incorporating ESG into it. It can be specific metrics. It can be a general sort of goal under individual performance. It can be a modifier. Audrey and then Blair, what are your thoughts on ESG and annual incentive plans?
No, I think David hit it exactly right. I think it's very hard for companies to just slot in ESG metrics into their existing infrastructure and expect that to have, the intended result. I think that the right approach is a lot more thoughtful and a lot more authentically aligned with strategic initiatives of the company more generally, and so that will vary by industry. And in areas where there's a real need for improvement, there needs to be sensitivity about how much improvement can be measured and what should be expected, and how to present that to the market without creating sort of, an undue focus on areas.
Blair, you and I chatted about this in other ways. One of the challenges, of course, is in your annual incentive plan, sometimes it's only limited real estate to give over to ESG metrics, and maybe there's more of an emphasis on incentive compensation than there should be in this area. So because there are other tools that boards have. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think the first and most important thing is just that you're measuring these goals to begin with, right? And people say all the time what get measured matters, and it's very, very true. And I think a number of companies are still in the exploration journey as to what makes sense. But when you do put in incentives, it is really important to think about that limited real estate that Paul and Dave have referred to, because you're still going to want a majority of your incentive to be based on financial measures. So you've probably got 20 to 30%, maybe 35% to play with. So you want to use that to the best effect. And Microsoft shared in another forum a framework that I thought was actually very helpful. First, is it a measure that you use in managing the business on an ongoing basis? Second, is it something that can work in good times and bad? So some of the same things we're asking about the financials and structures, does it work in good times and bad? So does it have longevity? Can you measure it well? And are you willing to share bad news about it? Because I think, it's one thing, these measures can be used either to signal or to drive performance. And, once you have them in there, I think the expectation is going to move on the investor front from signaling to perform. And, so you need to be ready to have bad messages around that or falling short of performance as well. The only other thing I was going to say, just on the strategic point, just to bring it home, because Audrey and Dave both focused on that, so and you had said, Paul, the energy companies, the climate change risk has been so front and center that it's, that is a huge strategic issue for them. So not surprisingly, they had the highest prevalence in the study that you did of climate change related measures. And for CPG, you might be looking at things like packaging, right? Or sourcing. I work with a number of the food companies in the CPG energy industry, and clearly sourcing is a big deal for them. The same in retail, sourcing cotton responsibly. So really thinking about those things that are going to drive your business and making sure you focus on the ones that are going to be most meaningful to all your stakeholders.
Great. And I love those 4 screens, right? Do you really use it in your business? Is it something that matters in good times and bad? Can you in fact measure it appropriately? And are you willing to live with a negative disclosure? And picking up on the point David made as well, like, this isn't the only tool in your toolbox. You got promotion. You have firing people, if people aren't doing well. And of course, as David also noted, your ESG metrics may vary across the C-suite too, right? Your CFO and your general counsel may have much more in the area of compliance, frankly, and then maybe some of your other executives. So let's turn, that's annual. Let's turn to long-term incentive compensation, because it seems like in a lot of cases, well, great, these are ESG metrics. They're long-term. They're about long-term performance. But we haven't thus far seen a lot of ESG metrics show up in LTI programs. So, Michael, maybe you could talk, Michael, a little bit about what the barriers have been and what advice you have for companies who are thinking that, maybe we want to build, there's extra real estate perhaps in our long-term incentive plans. Let's build some ESG metrics into those. What advice would you have for those companies?
Yeah, so I think this is an evolution, right? I think we'll inevitably see, and we were talking as a group a little bit before, you're going to see this trend grow, and I think we're going to see the transition from annual to long-term. There is a lot of reasons why it makes more sense in long-term in terms of the time periods to achievement. These are not usually annual goals that you can impact within 1 year. But I think a lot of the things that we've talked about on the annual side apply to the long-term side, and maybe even more so, right? So I think this is going to be a situation where folks are going to want to take their time and take a measured approach to this. I think you are going to want to look around peer group, industry group. Obviously, that has a huge impact on what's done. But comp committees, whether they're prepared to do it or not, have to start thinking about it, because I don't think it's going to go away. And we see shareholder proposals continuing to tick through on this. We see investor pressure. We see, the events of 2020, as David had mentioned, are really, pushing us in that direction. I think the things that folks need to think about are picking the right goals, right? Again, what can you explain the goal and how it ties to your long-term value, right? It's about long-term value creation. It's not just any goal that you want to pick. You want clear goals. You want attainable goals, right? There has to be some ability to, it doesn't mean it has to be an easy goal, but you want it to be attainable. I think Blair and Audrey and David have all mentioned kind of measurable goals and comparability, right? That's another issue that we face now, because investors are going to want some comparability. And, we just have so many organizations and so many standards out there now that I think that's been kind of a roadblock to people in terms of adopting these more broadly. There's also a lot of hard thought that has been touched upon in how you link it to your incentive. So I think David alluded to some of this, but if I say this particular goal is 10%, well, what am I saying optically about that? Does that mean it's not that important? Is it just right? On the flip side, I think as Blair mentioned, you don't want to have 90% ESG goals because people will say, well, what about financial performance, right? So I think people have been thinking about that. Who are you driving, right? You want to have people that that have the ability to impact the goals, and so I think that does talk about a little bit what you were alluding to, Paul, about is it a different measure for the CEO versus the CFO or down the organization. I think the disclosure issue is a huge issue in terms of, are you prepared to say, I didn't meet this goal? I think that's why you've seen the modifier as maybe the more popular tool that people have talked about in this, a downward modifier. So if I don't achieve my financial targets, then I don't even have to disclose, or the view would be that maybe I don't have to disclose failure to hit the ESG target because it's just a downward modifier anyway. I think people have thought about that as a way to kind of massage the disclosure a little bit in case there's bad news. It obviously doesn't eliminate the issue. So I think qualitative versus quantitative discretion, these are areas where discretion, I think, is probably going to have a bit of an impact on investors because you feel like, traditionally discretion's used, as we talked about earlier, to increase payouts, and so they're going to be wary of discretion in this area. And then I think internal and external messaging, coming back to the external point about that Blair made, if you fail to reach the goal, but also, are you able to explain to your investors why you've chosen this goal? Again, how can you link it to long-term value? And internally, do you have a robust enough reporting system from management to the board where they can be informed of what's going on? So I think there's just a lot to think about, and I think as ESG further develops, again, it's going to be an inevitability, but I think people are just trying to get their hands around how to adapt this in a way that makes sense for them, and that just takes
That's great.
time.
And speaking of time, we're just about out. We've got 2 minutes, and we've got to do the CLE verification code again, which is 12349. And I think we got 60 seconds or so. Any final words from anyone on advice for companies as they head into 2021 on comp and benefits? One piece of advice. Anyone?
I would just say, because I'm off of mute, be flexible and adaptable, right? I think that's one thing that we've learned in 2020.
And in terms of, thank you, and in terms of future resources, we are going to be focusing much more on ESG metrics in exec comp, and I think we could spend a lot of time on building it into long-term incentive compensation in 2021 at the conference board. We have other resources available to you, including a database that shows how companies are in fact changing their programs in light of COVID-19. It is the only database of its kind in the world, and it's on our website. We have a report on CEO and executive compensation practices 2020 you may want to look at. And we also, as I mentioned earlier, heard from investors representing $12 trillion in assets on social issues and how they expect companies to address those. We have a couple upcoming webcasts that if you enjoyed this, you'll also enjoy these. We've got one coming up tomorrow on human capital, a new era of disclosure. And then next week, we've got one on an outlook for the 2021 proxy season. So there's a lot to come. I just want to say a heartfelt thank you to our extraordinary panelists. This is a really valuable hour. I wish we had more time because there's a lot more to discuss, but you delivered a lot of bang for the buck, and since you're not getting paid for anything, it's really, your pay for performance is off the charts, my friend. Performance is up here, pay is way down at 0. Anyway, we'd ask everyone to complete the webcast evaluation form if you're still with us. We've got 124 people who still are. And just thank you all for tuning in today, and please join us for future programs here at the ESG Center. And thanks again, Audrey, Blair, Michael, David, you're phenomenal. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.